Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about the Middle East from the point of view of a book called The Last Messiah. We're joined by the guest who was given this story, actually sort of anonymously, from a stranger months ago in Dubai. He had to go by a pen name simply titled V.S. Marlowe because he's sort of kind of thinking that using his real name might cause him some problems. So we're going to be talking about this book today and a lot of the things that are going on in the Middle East to give people a better perspective about what we can expect or maybe get a better point of view about what this is all about. So I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. V.S. Marlowe. Thank you for joining us on the program today, sir.
I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
Now, I did receive this book by PDF, so kind of had a little challenge getting to read it. So why don't you go ahead and give our listeners an idea of what this Last Messiah is all about and how you came to come across this story.
Sure. Well, there are actually three stories in this book, and one is a treasure hunt, not unlike the Da Vinci Code, although the payoff at the end is a lot bigger. The second is the story of a rise of a new Middle Eastern leader who has not appeared yet, as far as I can tell. And then the third is a historical story about a conspiracy that parallels what's happening in the present, but that occurred in the Ottoman Empire when the Turks ruled the entire Middle East. A lot of people have forgotten that for about 600 years, Turkey was the dominant force in the Arab world. So those are the three stories. It was presented to me, and I must say that I'm not using my name because I can speak more freely if I don't. If I identify myself, it will cause problems with a lot of the clients that I work with in the Middle East who would be astonished and shocked at some of the things that I'm saying. But this book was brought to me after I'd given a speech in the Gulf, and I'd come back to my hotel one evening, was planning on having a quiet dinner and then hit the hay. But this fellow came up to me in the lobby and said he needed to talk to me, and I was trying to be polite. It seemed to me that he had heard me speak or seen some notice of it in the news because it was on television and so on. And he I figured he was, I would spend a couple of minutes with him and then be done. But then he presented this very bizarre story as fact, and he wanted to get it published, and he thought that because of my profile I could do that for him. And I'm approached quite often, people wanting, because I'm a published author, wanting me to help them do that. And it usually goes nowhere, but we spent a few minutes, and then we ended up having dinner together, and we actually talked for about 6 hours. And he gave me a manuscript, which he presented as nonfiction, and asked if I would do that for him, get it published. And I consulted with my attorney and read it and let it sit on the shelf for quite a while. But then when the Arab Spring erupted, which was one of the backdrops and predicted in the book, I thought I should pay more attention to it. And so that's really how the story came to me.
Mm-hmm. Now, what has it been like after you've put this out to be able to talk to people about it?
Well, it's a little bit odd because normally I would go out and do a book tour and so on, but I can't do that. It's an undercover operation, and I was quite aware that I might be I was being used to present disinformation from any of the sides or factions involved in the Middle East, whether it be Israel or Iran or the Turks or the United States or the Brits or whoever. So I was quite wary of that. And that's why I published it as fiction, so that there would be no one would have legal recourse. But it was presented to me as fact, and it had a lot of things that were not factual, including the rise of this Middle Eastern leader who is really the last Messiah of the title. But there were certain things in there that were quite intriguing, that were factual. The treasure hunt centered around an ancient Persian treasure, a ruby cup that was considered essential to controlling Eurasia. Alexander the Great drank from this cup. Julius Caesar tried to obtain it. I think Genghis Khan had it at one point, and the last person to have it was the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the late 16th century, and then it disappeared. And it's priceless. But that is fact. That's historically verified that this thing existed, and then it disappeared.
And this is a cup.
Yeah, it was they call it chalice, but in fact it was a cup. The illustrations of it in the biography of Suleiman show it as just a curved, like a small curved bowl, but a solid ruby.
Now, it seems interesting when you can consider this story, and I'm also thinking about, I can't remember the title right offhand, but anyway, that we seem to be chasing objects. Now, what's going on with that sort of thinking? That people get to a point of killing, assassinating, that we have these sort of things going on. What's going on in the minds of people over objects being so compelling that they would do things like this?
Well, in the case of this one, number one, it's a treasure missing for 400 years now. Solid ruby, about 3,000 years old. It was supposedly made to the order of Jamshid, who's the founder of ancient Persia, about 1,000 years or more before the current era. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago. So it just in the as an antiquity, it's quite valuable. But in the mythological or political piece to it, that it was believed that this cup was essential to controlling the territory of Eurasia. And back in the days when people tried to do that and conquer it, it had great sort of mystical and political value. But the really intriguing thing about this story that was given to me is that this cup also has a scientific value, and that is that it seems to be tied to a physical process that we're aware of through different routes, but not this one. An energy that is real. I suppose the closest thing we could compare it to would be fusion, and that this cup is tied to that. Now, this may all be malarkey, but it was quite intriguing. It's so well written, and because of the political implications about Iran and Israel and so on, that I thought it merited being brought to a larger audience.
Mm-hmm. Now, because you are a former diplomat and expert in the Middle East, you can really give listeners an insight about a lot of the chaos and trouble that we're actually seeing. I mean, we're looking at, things that are going on with the burning of embassies in Libya, what's going on with the eruptions in Yemen and Egypt. Really kind of gives some insight that perhaps the U.S. people, we get our news the way we get it, and it doesn't always seem to be accurate by any measure of the word, that we should come to understand about what really is happening here. Should we feel alarmed about what is happening over there?
Well, I think we certainly should feel alarmed, particularly if you're working for the State Department and you're commuting to your office in Cairo or whatever.
Okay.
But this is, I wasn't at all surprised. I was, this erupted, this sort of thing happened when those cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad were published in Denmark, I think, was that 3 or 4 years ago now. It caused this uproar that went on for months and caused a number of people to be killed in protests and violent acts and so on, death threats against the cartoonists who did it. So there are multiple layers to this, but obviously if you are seen as insulting the Prophet of Islam, then you're going to trigger an outcry over there. Apparently this film that was made, which describes Islam as a cancer and that the Prophet was a fraud and a womanizer and so on. I mean, these things have been said before. It's sort of a disparaging of the entire religion. And so if you do something like that and it becomes known in the Muslim world, you're going to draw a crowd, no doubt about it. It's
we can do that here in the United States.
Yeah.
No, it's another bunch of them. But over there, it really gets pretty ugly.
Well, it's just in that culture, we're Christians. If you're a Roman Catholic or a devout Christian, there's all sorts of things have been said about Jesus, and the Da Vinci Code presented the alternative narrative that possibly Jesus intended the first pope to be a woman, and all these sorts of things. But it doesn't result in death threats and that sort of thing. We're used to that kind of open discussion, but in the Muslim world, it just, especially when you touch certain hot buttons like slandering the prophet, it's going to cause a mess.
And what's interesting is Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has herself involved with this film that you were talking about by denouncing it. Now, why or what purpose does the U.S. have in its role with what's going on over there?
Well, with the in that culture, and the people who are out in the street and climbing the walls and shooting people, although I think there's certain hardened terrorists, especially in the attack in Libya with howitzers and I don't know, they had some sophisticated weaponry. That looked like a terrorist group that was waiting for a pretext to go ahead and do something. Now the others were these
sort of like us when we have our sort of sit-downs or protests here. Somebody sends in a little group to cause disruption, so they've got a reason to break the whole thing up. Right.
But these mobs, they're just street people. And they're generally, you're talking about people who are not well educated, not well informed, and they hear that somebody from the United States has insulted the prophet, and so boom, off they go to go throw rocks at the embassy or whatever. We're not talking about a very sophisticated crowd. It's a pretty we're talking about a street crowd, and sometimes these demonstrations are contrived. The people are paid to do that, but I think in this case these are legitimate. These are just average people, very religious people, and you push their button, and so they're climbing the embassy wall in Yemen.
Well, we can't entirely blame them for some of the damage they caused. As I understand, some protesters set fires to a Kentucky Fried Chicken and a Hardee's. I've kind of felt the same urge to do that here.
Well, no, look, the problem is, and it's certainly in this election year.
Right. That's what makes this so unique, is you've sensed this escalation before a presidential election.
Yes, I think it's a very poisonous mix. And then you have this continuing, drumbeat about attacking Iran and got to bomb them and so on, and Obama under pressure and Romney, critiquing him, and it's just an awful situation in which to try and conduct an intelligent foreign policy. But in fact, a lot of Muslims are puzzled that our freedom of speech would allow somebody to slander religion. That's just a hard concept for them, because they don't have that. I mean, they have blasphemy laws and all that, and in Pakistan there are people being tried for converting from Islam to Christianity. Same thing in Afghanistan. So it's a much more rigid and difficult situation for this kind of religious discourse. Unless you want to cause death and destruction, I wouldn't advise people to start, provoking street mobs in the Middle East. It's just, but I think that was I think possibly was the intent of the person who made that film.
So it's interesting, just to give our listeners some perspective, is that here in the United States we have what's considered a religious right, and people are very familiar with this group of people, and they're pretty hard-tacked as far as their line of religion goes, but what you're talking about goes even beyond that.
Yes, it's just, number one, you're talking about countries in general that are not, they don't have the long tradition of democracy or public discourse that the United States does. They don't have they're on a different socioeconomic level. I mean, Yemen is very poor. Egypt is just desperately poor. They're not like the oil-rich countries like Saudi and the United Arab Emirates. So, and they have educational deficiencies. The educational system is not working. So, comparing the two, I mean, there are certain parallels, I suppose, between our religious fundamentalists in the U.S. and in the Muslim world, but the comparison breaks down too.
Mm-hmm. Now, how will this affect, I guess, people in the United States Because face it, we have people from Israel, the Middle East, who are here. Because there, obviously was some concern after 9/11 about the Muslim world, but yet at the same time, you would see as U.S. citizens are actually seeking to understand more about the characteristics and the philosophies of these people. So how do you see that playing out here on our own soil?
Well, I think it really depends on how these different crises play out. If this film thing simmers down, and like the cartoon, it went on for a long time, but the violent acts, if they peter out, then, well, number one, the impact is if you're planning a trip to go see the pyramids, you might think twice about it. I mean, Egypt depends on tourism, and I certainly don't want to give them any more trouble than they've got with their economy, which is, has suffered from the Arab Spring. But it's possible that this would make American citizens targets. I think statistically it's not going to be significantly greater than, walking through a dark part of New York City or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. at night. When you look at statistics of violence, this kind of violence, and the likelihood of an American being affected by this is quite small. You're more likely to have a wreck driving out of your driveway or something like that, or be involved in a domestic dispute with a member of your own family. I mean, I've looked at these statistics about violence because there have been some allegations that culture is more violent than ours and so on. And there's certain kinds of violence, political violence, I suppose, yes, you see a lot more of it. But when you compare other death tolls in wars and so on, the West has got not got a great record in that sense when you consider the Holocaust and World War II and all these things. So I think if that one simmers down, then it isn't going to have a great effect. If Israel attacks Iran, then I think everything's up in the air, because then there's going to be blowback that we haven't even anticipated yet. They might get away with it, and it would simmer down, and the worst case scenarios not happen. But I think it's going to disrupt oil markets. It's going to cause gasoline prices to go up. It may trigger all sorts of new terrorist attacks coming out of Iran and its sympathizers. Iran has been pretty quiet in that sense. The terrorism we've been dealing with is not related to Iran. It's coming out of the Sunni world, the extremists from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and Pakistan and so on. Hardly any of them are Shiites, which is what Iran is. So, I mean, it's very confusing. I know Americans are always scratching their heads when they look at this, trying to figure it out. But I'm more concerned about that than I am about these embassy attacks, because I think that's going to peter out unless some new provocation comes up.
Now, in the book, The Last Messiah, there is a thought of disinformation that may have been planted by U.S., Israeli, British, or even Iranian intelligence. Yes. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I was touching on it when I was talking about the Ruby Cup. It is in the book, and I don't want to give too much of the story away because I want people to buy it. But
I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
Right. It's the cup is related to weapons research and energy, and I've lost the train of thought again. What was your original question?
It was the thought that there may be disinformation which was planted in this book. Yeah.
Well, the implication is that Iran is on the trail of this energy source, and that other countries are also pursuing it. It's an alternate route to fusion, and so when I look at that, I go, well, who would, if this is not true? It's possibly true, but I think the odds are more likely that it's serving another purpose, and that could be is Iran trying to bluff the world into thinking that it's onto something that's much bigger than a one atomic bomb? Are the Israelis trying to justify a preemptive attack by putting out some disinformation like this, or if it has basis in fact? Are the Americans up to something, or the British? Because these are the ones, and the Russians too. Everybody always meddling and up to their own agendas. So that's where that might lead.
Okay. Now, my question is, as you were putting this book together, were there insights or sort of personal views or changes that this story might have created for you?
Well, my personal inclination is towards peace and dialogue. I spent many years as a diplomat, and I still essentially use those skills in the work, the consulting and advising I do for different governments. Mm-hmm. So my premise is that shooting at each other is the last resort, and I won't say that it isn't. There are certain situations where, in self-defense, you have to do that, but I'm generally not in favor of preemptive attacks and this sort of thing. But this book indicated that it proposes that within Iran there is a cabal, a movement that's also infiltrated out into other parts of the Muslim world, in Turkey and the Arabs, that is an ancient conspiracy that has its own agenda, that it's working under the cover of Islam, but in fact it isn't Islamic, it's something older. And another interview I did, they picked up on that, and there's been a lot of talk on the web about it, that this ancient conspiracy has its roots in the earlier religion of Persia, which was the religion of Zoroaster, and his Persian name was Zarathustra, and the religion, which still exists in reduced form, is called Zoroastrianism, and Parsis in India are also a spin-off of that. But it changed my views in thinking that, well, maybe there are sinister folks up to this sort of elaborate stuff that goes on for centuries, a plan that takes, centuries to fulfill. So in that sense, because some of this seemed to be key to things that were happening, after this book was written, I thought, well, maybe there's more to this. But my starting point is, I don't believe in preemptive war. I don't think that Israel or the United States should be starting wars. They don't know how to finish. We don't know how, as we saw in the lesson in Iraq, how that went in so many different directions from what the original plan was, and how many years was it? 9 years of destruction that's still going on.
Yeah, that was a very poorly brought out war. There's no doubt about that, and certainly even more poorly executed. I mean, we could see the result of with George W. Bush, having to terminate Donald Rumsfeld. It's like, well, if you're having to do something like this, something's not working. Right. What then do you do? But now you're so dug into the stupidity of your mistake that you're just better off staying stupid and staying the course until maybe you can get out with a little bit of esteem.
Well, once you get into these situations, it's really hard to get out, and that's what Colin Powell was warning when they were contemplating that war, was that, well, once you break this thing called Iraq, you've got to fix it. And they didn't have a plan for fixing. They thought that, the people were going to welcome them with roses, and that they were going to take the Iraqi oil revenues and pay for the war that way, and so on. And we know how that turned out.
Yeah, and what was really fascinating about that particular scenario is that at first Iraqi citizens were welcoming the United States because we were there mainly to kind of put order out of the chaos back. But then it seemed that we were protecting our own interest and allowing what was going on outside of that protected area to just continue, and it was frustrating the citizens to the point, why don't you just pack your stuff up and get the hell out of our country, basically?
Right.
And so when you have a scenario that had happened like that, and then you see us possibly being involved in this again, what happens if that plays out again? I mean, it's almost as though we follow our own ridiculousness. I don't want to say stupidity. That could be extreme, like what's going on over there. But it's like, don't you learn from the lessons? And as citizens of the United States, do we really feel that we want to not only not be involved in something like this, but certainly not blackmarked for decisions that we didn't make in the first place that put us there.
Yeah, it's. I don't think that anyone in the U.S. High Command now would want to replicate that experience in Iran or anywhere else. And as you saw, the way the U.S. dealt with this Libyan thing, whether you like it or not, at least we didn't send in 200,000 troops to do it. It was all done by air, and the NATO joined in, and the Libyans basically did the fighting for themselves. And I think it turned out so far for the best, but it's very unstable. Syria, that what a can of worms that is, and there's certain folks saying that Obama's being too soft and that he should be in there, and I know we're supplying weapons to some of the rebels, but Syria is 10 times more complicated than Libya. It adjoins Israel. The Iranians are meddling there. The Russians are involved. The Turks are next door, and it's just a terrible thing. It would be there's no way for the United States to occupy Syria without regretting it, I think. And Iran, trying to occupy Iran, I mean, we're done with that. We can't afford it, I don't think.
Right.
In lives or in money.
Now, with The Last Messiah, the book that you penned, tell us what you hope most that readers will gain from this. Is it perspective? What is it exactly?
Well, the Messiah who arises he's an interesting figure because he is a Muslim. He is a Shiite. He comes from Saudi Arabia, but then people don't realize, but there is a Shiite group in northeastern Saudi Arabia. That's where he comes from. He starts out as a folk singer, but he kind of morphs into an evangelist and then a political leader. And his message is not alien to what we would like to hear. I mean, it's not about jihad and so on. It's about healing injustice and educating people and so on. It sounds, I mean, he almost sounds like an Islamic Jesus. And I must say that this figure has triggered a lot of attention from Christian audiences. It seems to tap into certain beliefs about an antichrist or this, that, or the other. And I don't have an opinion on that because that's not where I'm coming from, but a lot of people see that, and if they see that there, so be it. But the interesting thing about this character, although as he rises and governments are overthrown and he becomes sort of the de facto leader of multiple countries, of course the West is very alarmed because it's like their worst nightmare, their worst case scenario, that here's someone who's uniting the Arab world and the Middle East, and he's not necessarily our friend. But in fact, when you listen to what he's saying all the right things. And there's so much distrust on both sides that even though he's reaching out in peace and trying to establish a dialogue, the West is preparing to take military action. And I think it poses some interesting questions because it breaks the stereotypes that we have that if such a leader were to arise, he would be our enemy, he would be some horrible, spiteful, vindictive person, and that's not at all how this character is presented. But because there's so many layers to this story and how it came about, it could be, it could have some ulterior motive, But what I liked about it was that it presented the possibility that there might be some good force arising from a very troubled world that might give us some hope, because for most of my life the Middle East has just been a source of anguish and anxiety and fear and anger. It hasn't been a hopeful landscape at all.
It's interesting that you say that because I can even go back as far as my childhood, and I remember when I first encountered any ideal of the Middle East, and I believe it could have been PBS network. And this is back as early as, say, 1971, 1972. I was born in 1964. So, you're looking at seven years old, somewhere right around there. But I also lived on a military base in Texas, And I'm looking at this war going on, and then, of course, over the years, you continue to see that this is still going on. And, of course, as a child, you're just thinking, well, why can't these people just, be nice to each other? You don't think of things any other way. And then it came into, it was about 1978, 1979, President Jimmy Carter is in office, and they're about to bridge, the peace, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. Yeah. Even as a child, or a young teen at that time, I should say, I felt hope, even though I really, again, didn't totally understand what was going on. But I felt that certain hope. And then, of course, we know what happened. Sadat was assassinated. He was killed. Yes. Mm-hmm. And that actually broke my heart. And again, without really knowing what really was going on over there. Mm-hmm. And so I figured that even if a child such as myself could kind of get a feel for what is right and wrong over there, why can't the adults get it?
Well, I'm afraid that certain of the adults are just locked into a certain mindsets and policies that they can't get out of, which is tragic, because I think one of the main reasons that this region is still so difficult for the United States is because of the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's still not fixed. Mm-hmm. And now there's less hope than there was 15 years ago.
My goodness.
And that is, I think if we could get that one fixed, then a lot of the energy and the anger would be discharged, because a lot of Muslims, Arabs have grown up their entire lives, and they've just heard about, Israel bashing on the Palestinians and so on. And it's a counter narrative to what Americans, because Americans have much better understanding of Israel and Israelis, ethnic and religious ties and so on. We really we sort of align with Israel naturally, but there's a whole lot of people on the other side who've gotten a totally different view of this, and I deal with them almost every day, and I feel like if we could get that fixed, then a lot of other stuff could be dealt with. But it's just a flashpoint and a constant. And now with this possible war between Iran and Israel, it's just brought Israel back into the hot seat. If we could get Israel integrated into the neighborhood as a Middle Eastern country and not something that's seen by the neighbors as an implant or something like that, then I think that would deal with a lot of this. Not that there aren't other big problems to deal with. I mean, conflicts between Shiites and Sunnis and everything else. But if we could just get that one, I think it would make the solutions easier and more doable. But right now, it seems worse than any time in my life, except when they were at war. Because there've been how many wars since 1948? Were there 5?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy stuff. If this gets fixed, what could we experience as a result?
Well, I think if we could defuse that, if Israel and Palestine could live together as partners or neighbors, even if they didn't like each other, but they weren't killing each other,
right?
And they found some way to work around their issues, then I think then these radical groups, they can't exploit that anymore. They'll have to find another reason. But that one is, they're so used to that one, it would throw them off balance for a while. The fringe, and I've got to tell you, because I know Palestinians and Israelis both, and the Palestinians are perhaps the most, they have more in common with the Israelis than any other Arab group. They're very well educated. They're very entrepreneurial. They're very successful, especially the ones who've immigrated and gone to Europe or the U.S. or elsewhere in the Arab world. And I don't know why they can't. If the politicians can't do it, why can't the business people do it? Because they both. I mean, Israel has got a really dynamic economy and information technology and so on. Palestinians would be natural allies for those kind of ventures. Why can't they find some way to solve the problem through business or through because I think the politicians are just stuck, and they're just like robots reciting the same thing over and over. And there are certain red lines for an Israeli leader. Their touch point is the Holocaust, and so no Israeli leader can go back put the Israeli people at that kind of risk. And that's why this Iran thing is on their radar. I mean, they don't want a nuclear holocaust. And then on the other side, it's the Muslims are saying we didn't do the original Holocaust. Why do we have to pay the price for solving the problem? Because the Holocaust was done by Europeans, not Arabs.
Right. I can't help but think of an episode of the original Star Trek series, Gene Roddenberry, where you have the two guys that were going after each other. Half of their face was white and the other half was black. Yeah. And the other one had, just the opposite, but it was black and white, and they just couldn't seem to get it.
Because as Americans, our whole narrative is of solving problems and moving forward, not going backwards or being stuck.
Right.
And this one is quite frustrating,
I can imagine it would be.
Yeah.
The book is The Last Messiah. Our guest today, V.S. Marlowe. Could you please give out a website where people can find how to download the book or get a hold of it?
Well, I think the easiest way is just to go to Amazon.com to the books, and then just do a search on The Last Messiah, V.S. Marlowe, and it pops up.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. We bring these kinds of talks on, and I usually try to keep my questions fairly basic because there are a lot of people that are still kind of like that. Like, you only get the kind of news we get here in the United States, but, you're outside of that sphere of influence, so you can give a better perspective for people who really, so a lot of times they go about their day like, oh, those guys are still going crazy over there. I don't get it, but I'd like to understand a little bit to get fresher insight about what's happening there so that maybe they'll become as proactive as you can in a situation like this to help solve the problem.
Well, it was a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you again for joining us here on the program.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, the book is The Last Messiah. Our guest today, V.S. Marlowe. Find out more, visit us at our blog spot, and be sure to sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. I'm Daniel Davis. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.